Have you ever wondered how to even start Bible study? Well, we are working on a variety of different ways to help you learn to do that, and this is just one of them. In this short clip of a much longer podcast between me and my friend Rob from the Babbling Pastors Podcast, we're going to work through and break down how to develop a sermon, which is very similar about how you would just do Bible study on your own. So in this first clip, we talked to Rob, which is a pastor in North Dakota, and my friend since elementary school, about how he develops his sermons out, at least the first step of that. Hopefully you find it helpful, and I'll meet you at the end of this video. Hey guys, welcome to the Babbling Pastor Podcast with your host, Michael and
Rob.
Today, we were talking before we started recording, Rob, and I think this is an important note to make. Some people may be here because of the Greg Locke video or the videos we did. And I think we just need to let them know from the get-go, if they haven't already picked up from the thumbnail and the title, this is a different sort of situation. Like, we're going a different direction this time. So should they expect the same thing?
So what you can expect today. So Greg Locke, that video blew up because in one sense, at least one of the reasons is because Greg Locke doesn't do what we're talking about.
Oh,
hey,
that was a nice bridge. You did a very good job there.
Yeah. Just made that up.
Yeah. So today, what we are going to do is work through, and I think it's very helpful. I've done a video of this myself already. I think when I was on Keith Foskey's podcast, we talked about this, and I thought it would be a really good idea to break down, like between the two of us, a couple of like videos, or if you're, a Patreon, you're viewing this all at once, but of kind of sermon prep. And I think, and I want to pick your brain before we get into it here. Sermon prep, I think, really is just like Bible study that every Christian should do with a couple extra steps. Would that be an accurate would you agree with that sort of sentiment?
Yeah. And I guess how I would say it is that there is, so for me, sermon prep is like, when I prep to preach, I've never studied that text that in depth. Like for me, no like other Bible study that I typically would do is quite the same depth level as sermon prep. I mean, it should be, I guess, for us, but I know just for me personally, after doing the book of Ephesians or the book of Matthew or whatever, like I can go back and reference Matthew in ways that I couldn't just with like a reading plan or like some basic Bible study stuff and taking some notes and stuff like that. And so it is like it's a really in-depth Bible study. Because if you're going to preach or teach through something, you better know it,
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point, because so not too long ago we worked on Wednesday night. Occasionally we'll do like break off sort of topics, and one of those break off topics was how to read your Bible. And one of the people mentioned, it probably was maybe the fourth, fifth night, that they're like, do I need to do this every time I read my Bible? Because what they were struggling with is like, well, when do I just like read it straight through? Isn't there a time just to read it straight through and not do all this like deep digging in? And I think that's an important, as we get into this and sort of defining it, there is a time to understand, like, yeah, there's a time to just sit down and read it, and then I think there's another time to sit down and like really dig in, and you need to, like, those times are obviously going to be different, and you're going to need to differentiate those. But I do think you're right. Like, there is a point in which, like, I think what we're going to be talking about today is going to be not for everyone in the sense that I think there's going to be a point to where we might get into like talking about some like word studies or digging into the Greek, that some people are going to be like, I don't know if I need to do that. And so like, depending on what video you're watching here, like how far along we get in here, there may be a process that, like, hopefully this will help you up to a point, and then there's a point and maybe you're like, I don't know, maybe I do that sometimes, but it's a very like minor part of my study. So I think hopefully at some point you're going to find something helpful here, and then there's going to be things that you go, I think I've reached my limit. Like, I'm not going to do that all the time, because obviously, like you said, you're preaching through a text. And to do that, you're going to do some deeper digging than maybe, the average person would do on a Monday morning as they're, reading the Bible before they go to work. So with that being said, I kind of want to break down your process before we get into it. Then I'll kind of explain mine. What's your very 3,000 foot view before we kind of dive into this and start looking at like an example text you've done? What is your 3,000 foot view of like, if I had to explain this in 5 minutes, what are my steps that I do?
Okay. So read the text. I read it, over and over again. I actually am beginning to read it, Sunday, the Sunday before, um, and focus on that. And then I'm obviously prayer. I know that sounds really cliche, but that's it's pretty important part of it. And as far as the technical bits, I think so. I get on my whiteboard after I've read the text. I kind of am familiar enough with it. I could, if in the case of what we're going to look at today, it's one verse that I did. So that's I have that memorized. Obviously, by the time and if it's like several verses, I at least have the flow of it memorized. And then I get up on my whiteboard, write the verse down, and start puking the things that come to my mind. And so the caveat there is, for me, the whiteboard thing that could include heresy. I'm just writing things right as soon as they like my thoughts down about this phrase or that phrase or question that I think people will have or whatever it might be. And then at some point in the whiteboard phase, I get antsy and pace back and forth, and then I'll go and start just typing the sermon document, and then I'll edit it several times between then. But the whiteboard thing gives me like questions to go look up, language things like Greek or Hebrew or whatever, and all of that. But it all kind of for me happens on the whiteboard. At least that's where it starts, and then then I write it, and then I get here at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning, and I pray more, and I tweak it, and every once in a while I like rewrite a big portion of it or whatever. But
no, I like that you have a heresy section built in. Like, okay, these ideas are never going to make it to the actual sermon because these are just thoughts and they're not good thoughts. So we're just going to leave those on the whiteboard.
Yeah. Well, I might, it might be like something that I'll write on the whiteboard that is completely wrong once I look at the verse and study it or the language or something like that, or make a connection that I didn't think of while I was initially looking through that. And so it might be like, if the whiteboard was my sermon, it probably 80% of the time there would be something wrong with my sermon. the whiteboard is very much just initial, getting stuff out there that, I better look this up. What about this?
Yeah. And I think that's important because my process is similar. So what I'll do is I'll read through the passage. We've talked about this briefly before, depending on where the passage is. Obviously, and this is what when I was talking to Keith about like what's beneficial in the way you do it, you work through books, and so does he. And so it's just easier to, the flow of what's going on, to walk your people through that flow. When I am starting, it could be anywhere because we kind of we pick passages. And so the downside of that obviously is if I start in the middle, like in this case, we're going to look at Ephesians 4 verse 15, like I'm going to have to catch them up in my context. So I'm going to have to read all of that and try to summarize that efficiently up to that. Now I also have, and when we kind of share the screens here in a minute, I'll show sort of my process too. It's sort of like a whiteboard process, only it's on my iPad, where I walk through and I go, okay, well, what's the question here? How do these things connect? How can I, when I'm preaching, visually or verbally take what I visually see here and communicate that to them? I've considered, I haven't done it, but I've considered actually just screen sharing on our screen, my iPad, and just showing them like the process. But the idea being like, how do I communicate kind of basically your whiteboard process to them in a way that they can see as they've got the scriptures open to them. And the idea being, again, like you said, what's the flow of thought? What are the questions being asked here? What are the things that, depending on where we're at, so in Ephesians here, what's Paul trying to get across in this particular passage?
Yeah.
And then again, like you said, write the sermon down. I don't have a transcript. I don't know if you do. I do bullet points. And then that is basically like an anchor for me when I'm preaching. I don't really even preach off of that. It's more of I've already kind of got that memorized. And then if I lose my spot or if I go off on some rabbit trail, I can kind of come back to that and regain my place. But the idea, again, being that that's there because everything I've studied up till the point where I preach is kind of in my head. And so I already know kind of what I'm going to say. And that bullet point sort of paper is really just the big points of what I've already done in the prep, in what you would consider the whiteboard phrase. And I think here's the thing that I think is really helpful in your whiteboard phase that I hope people pick up is that it's good to like maybe have a piece of paper or something on the side as you're studying to write those questions down, or to do it so that when you are reading, you haven't forgotten like, a chapter before I had this question. Oh, and now it's answered here. And so you sort of have that there to work through. Some people just, I guess I say that because some people don't know how they study the best in school. We went to elementary school together. No one ever taught me how to study, and I was totally lost. I thought I was the dumbest kid in the world because nobody taught me like there's different ways that people learn. And I didn't know until I started dating my now wife, and she was like, here's a note card. I'm like, what's a note card? And she's like, well, this will help you. I didn't like know that there were ways, different ways people's brains worked. So anyway, that being said, let's start at Ephesians 4, chapter 5, or Ephesians 4, verse 15, rather. I'm going to share your screen, kind of walk us through. Let me get over there real quick. Walk us through your process here in regards to kind of what you've done here.
Yeah. So I'll have okay, you'll even see up here at the top there's the verse or the reference or whatever the text is I'm preaching, and then there's like a what I think the title might be, or the subject matter, something like that. And then on the left hand side I'll just write it out, usually with like prepositions in mind. I mean, for the most part, or if but speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, that is Christ. So that's all written from vertically from top to bottom on the left hand side of the screen. And then like the word but is its own line, because it's a connector, right? It's connecting us to something before, right? And so that has its own line, because I already know like that, or and would be the same thing, or therefore, right? That kind of idea. There's a connection there. He's connecting whatever he's about to say next. Is more than ever, you have to pay attention to the context, right? Or you're not gonna understand it. So there's a whole line of thought behind the but. And so there's so what I wrote here, rather than the previous, or rather than false doctrine. So he just finished talking about some of these things, not to be thrown around by every wind of doctrine. The trickery of men does this, craftiness and deceitful scheming. Is what they do. And so instead of all of those things, what he's gonna talk about, right? This is the expectation for believers. And then you get into the expectation for believers. What is he getting at here? Speaking the truth in love. And you could, sometimes so just for reference there, sometimes it's this simple, and sometimes my board looks like that.
So that looks like a dispensationalist board from Revelation is what that looks like.
Well, that's just from Ephesians 2. But Speaking the truth in love, right? Like this is something that this is a bumper sticker thing almost, right? But what does all that mean? So even just the word speaking, I started thinking about that word, not only actions. So not only in what you do, but one of the things that it made me think, of like one of the things that you might hear is this, what's the quote that's attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi? It's
Preach the gospel,
preach
use
the
words if
gospel
necessary. Yeah.
yeah, use words if necessary. And it's like, no, they're required. That's part of it, right? Like, and so it's like this actually requires us using our words, right? And it made me immediately think about the how will they know without a preacher verse.
So
And
real quick, I
yeah,
don't want to like get your train of thought off, but I think that part right there, referencing, this is where, just for, again, not just for pastors that are prepping sermons, but I think just people in general, this, one of the benefits of being in the Word and just reading your Bible is basically what just happens here, is that when you're reading other text and studying other text, things like this will pop up in your head. Like there's been a lot of times where I'm prepping sermons and I'll be like, man, that's exactly like what, like, so for example, this is Paul, but when I was doing some study the other day, when we were talking about like good works. So like I was talking, Paul, when he's talking to Titus, is like talking about like, make sure you train the people up for good works. And I'm like, man, James is talking about the same thing. Like, so this idea is that whenever you're studying, again, not because you're going to present it, you're just studying it, but it's just like real reassurance. Like, look at how cohesive in this case, the apostles are in their message to the believers. And so when you know that and you're studying the Word, you're going to be reading things and being like, oh, he said the same thing here that James said over here, or he said the same thing here in Ephesians that he tells the Colossians, right? And so again, it's just like, no, it's simple, but when you're prepping or whenever you're even talking and presenting the gospel to people, things like that will happen where you're saying this and you'll find yourself quoting other letters because you've been in them. And I think that's just beneficial, because people will hear preachers all the time and be like, man, how does he know the Bible so well? Bro, he just reads it. Like that's all he does. So,
yeah. And so to your point, I would say even other books, reading the script. So I would just if we're talking about the Bible, right? First of all, I would say do some, read a chronological plan, and then do like kill yourself and do like the Bible in 90 days thing, and just you would be surprised how helpful it is to know where things are, kind of, or what the overarching theme and story of the scriptures are. If you just like kill it in 90 days once in your life, it's a lot of reading, but it's really cool. Do those kinds of things, like be in the Word. You're not gonna know it if you're not if you're not in it. And you're right. Like a lot of times, this probably isn't a good example because there's only like one or those moments there. But like a lot of times, not only will different scriptures come to mind, but things that I've been reading other than scripture will come to mind. Like if I'm reading a Piper book, or I have sets from Puritans that like I kind of use devotionally at times, like works of the Puritans and some different things like that. So just whatever you're feeding into yourself is the kind of stuff that this is going to remind you of when you're walking through a text, whether it's Bible study or preaching, doesn't matter.
Hopefully you found that helpful. If you did, let me know below. What are your sort of tips and tricks for Bible study, or if you're a pastor, sermon development? Do they line up sort of with Rob's and I's, or are they completely different? Let me know below. Now, if you did find that helpful, a few things you can do. One, the entire podcast episode is available for patrons now. If you want to join our Patreon, it's down in the description, or you can go ahead and subscribe so that next week when the second half of this episode comes out, you can catch it then. As always, I'll talk to you later.